Have you ever heard of a war that was sparked by a severed ear? It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but in 1739, it became the dramatic opening act of a brutal, decade-long clash between two of the world's greatest maritime empires, Great Britain and Spain. This is the story of the War of Jenkins Ear, a conflict often lost in the footnotes of history, but one that was fought over vast oceans for treasure, territory, and imperial pride. This war wasn't just about a single gruesome incident. It was the explosive result of decades of simmering tension. Imagine the Americas in the early 18th century, a treasure chest for the Spanish Empire, with its colonies closed to outside trade. But Britain, a rising naval power with a greedy eye for commerce, wanted in. Legally, Britain was granted a few limited trade rights, like the Asiento de Negros, to supply slaves and the right to send a couple of ships a year. In reality, this was just a cover for a massive illegal smuggling operation. British ships flooded the Caribbean, trying to bypass Spain's high tariffs, and Spain's coast guard, the Guarda Costas, fought back fiercely. They boarded British ships, seized cargo, and clashes were common. One of these clashes involved a British captain named Robert Jenkins. In 1731, his ship was boarded, and he claimed a Spanish officer sliced off his ear. For 7 years, the story was mostly ignored, but by 1738, politicians in London were looking for any excuse to pressure the government into a war with Spain. They brought Captain Jenkins before Parliament, and some say he dramatically held up his severed, pickled ear. The public was outraged. The story, masterfully spun, painted Spain as a cruel tyrant and Britain as the victim. It was the perfect pretext. Britain's ambitions were clear. They wanted to smash open Spain's American markets, grab valuable territory, and weaken their old rival. On the other side, Spain's goal was purely defensive: protect their empire, their treasure fleets, and their sovereignty from British encroachment. The stage was set for a truly global conflict. The war began with a stunning and ultimately misleading British victory. In November 1739, Admiral Edward Vernon, with just 6 ships, sailed up to the Spanish port of Portobello in modern-day Panama. In less than 24 hours, he captured and destroyed the fortress. News of the victory electrified Britain. The song "Rule Britannia" was composed to celebrate, and places like London's Portobello Road were named in its honor. This easy win created a dangerous wave of overconfidence. The British public and its leaders believed that the Spanish Empire was a hollow shell, ready to crumble. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. Buoyed by the victory at Portobello, Britain launched one of the largest amphibious expeditions in its history. The target, Cartagena de Indias, the jewel of the Spanish Caribbean, a heavily fortified port city in modern-day Colombia. The British force was staggering: over 180 ships, nearly 3,000 cannons, and more than 27,000 men. This massive army included British regulars, American colonial volunteers led by George Washington's older half-brother, and thousands of sailors. They outnumbered the city's defenders almost 10-1. On paper, it should have been an easy victory, but the Cartagena expedition turned into a complete and utter disaster. First, the British leadership was a mess. Admiral Vernon and the army commander, General Wentworth, despised each other, and their constant bickering paralyzed decision-making. Second, British arrogance was off the charts. After some initial success, Vernon was so confident of victory that he sent a message back to London announcing it. Medals were even minted in Britain, showing the Spanish commander kneeling in surrender. This hubris blinded them to the genius of Cartagena's defenses and its one-eyed, one-armed, one-legged commander, the legendary Admiral Blas de Lezo. But the deadliest enemy wasn't the Spanish cannon. It was disease. Crammed aboard their ships in the sweltering tropical heat, the British forces were ravaged by an apocalyptic outbreak of yellow fever. Thousands died without ever seeing combat. The mighty expeditionary force was decimated not by bullets, but by mosquitoes. The siege failed spectacularly, and the surviving British limped away in disgrace, having suffered one of the worst defeats in their naval history. While the disaster at Cartagena was unfolding, another British expedition was underway on the other side of the world. Commodore George Anson was sent with a small squadron to sail around South America, attack Spanish possessions in the Pacific, and, with any luck, capture a legendary Manila galleon, a Spanish treasure ship sailing from the Philippines. This voyage became an epic tale of survival against impossible odds. Battered by storms rounding Cape Horn and ravaged by scurvy, Anson's fleet was reduced to a single ship. The vast majority of his crew perished. Yet, after years of hardship, Anson achieved his goal. Off the coast of the Philippines, he captured the galleon Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, filled with over 1 million gold coins. He returned to Britain a hero, his incredible feat a much-needed propaganda victory. But strategically, it was a sideshow. While Anson hit a single jackpot, Spain was quietly adapting its entire strategy. Meanwhile, on the North American mainland, the war took on a different character. The conflict centered on the tense border between the new British colony of Georgia and Spanish Florida. In 1740, Georgia's founder, James Oglethorpe, led an attack on the Spanish fortress city of St. Augustine. The siege failed when the British Navy couldn't stop Spanish ships from resupplying the garrison. 2 years later, the Spanish launched their own counter-invasion of Georgia. This time, Oglethorpe rallied his local forces and famously repelled the Spanish at the Battle of Bloody Marsh, securing Georgia's frontier. These back-and-forth campaigns ended in a stalemate, with neither side able to land a decisive blow. So, how did Spain, facing the full might of the Royal Navy, manage to hold its own? Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, defense, and asymmetry. Spain knew it couldn't match the British fleet ship for ship. Instead, they relied on a network of heavily fortified ports like Cartagena, and Cartagena wasn't a one-off success. British attacks on other Spanish ports like La Guaira and Puerto Cabello were also beaten back. Spain's stone fortresses proved more than a match for Britain's wooden ships. To go on the offensive, Spain unleashed its most effective weapon: privateers. These were privately owned ships given government permission to attack enemy commerce. Spanish privateers swarmed the Atlantic trade routes, capturing hundreds of British merchant vessels. This was a low-cost, low-risk war of attrition that hit Britain where it hurt most: its wallet. While Britain was gambling everything on high-risk expeditions like Cartagena and Anson's voyage, Spain was slowly bleeding its enemy dry, one merchant ship at a time. Ultimately, the War of Jenkins Ear didn't end with a climatic battle. It just fizzled out. Why? 2 huge factors came into play. The first was the sheer tyranny of distance and disease. As the British learned at Cartagena, projecting power across the Atlantic was a logistical nightmare, and tropical diseases were a more effective killer than any army. The second and most important factor was that a much bigger war had broken out in Europe, the War of the Austrian Succession. This massive continental conflict sucked in all the major powers, including Britain, Spain, and their ally, France. The fighting in the Americas suddenly became a sideshow. Britain needed its fleet closer to home to defend against a potential French invasion. The colonial war was put on the back burner, and a stalemate was declared. The 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle officially ended the fighting, essentially resetting everything to how it was before the war began. So, who actually won? While it ended in a draw, Spain arguably achieved its strategic goals more successfully. Its empire remained intact, its trade routes were protected, and British smuggling was curtailed. Britain, on the other hand, failed to achieve any of its grand ambitions. The war did have lasting consequences, though. The issue of the Asiento was finally settled, and the conflict prompted a temporary diplomatic thaw between Britain and Spain. But the underlying rivalry remained, ready to erupt again in the 7 Years' War just a few years later. The War of Jenkins Ear stands as a harsh lesson in the limits of sea power, a testament to resilient defense, and a fascinating, bloody chapter in the epic struggle for the Americas. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story of imperial rivalry and pickled ears interesting, please give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten history. See you next time.